In the early days of the war, when the world watched in shock as tanks rolled across borders and cities shook under bombardment, few people paid much attention to what was happening out on the Black Sea. To most, the sea seemed quiet, just water, sky, and the occasional ship passing by. But for those living along Ukraine's southern coast, the sea had become a silent battlefield. Russia's Black Sea Fleet looked unbeatable. Big warships, cruisers, frigates, submarines sat near Crimea like floating fortresses. They blocked ports, fired missiles at cities, and made it nearly impossible for grain ships to leave. For months, Ukraine seemed helpless against them. The world assumed that without a real navy of its own, there was nothing Ukraine could do but endure. Then, in the summer of 2022, strange photos started appearing online. Blurry satellite shots showed tiny objects moving near Odessa. Small, dark, boat-like shapes, no bigger than a pickup truck. At first, no one knew what they were. Some thought they were buoys. Others guessed they were fishing gear. Russian state TV laughed them off, calling them children's toys and Ukrainian bath ducks. Even some Western news outlets treated them as a curiosity, not a threat. After all, how could something so small possibly challenge a warship? But in a modest workshop tucked away in a quiet Kyiv neighborhood, far from the front lines, a small group of people were working day and night on something they believed could change everything. They weren't generals or admirals. Most had never served on a ship. Some had studied engineering in college. Others had worked in tech startups before the war. A few were former soldiers who'd traded their rifles for soldering irons. What they shared was a stubborn refusal to accept that the sea had to stay under enemy control. They called their invention the Sea Baby. It wasn't glamorous. It looked like a simple fiberglass hull with a motor, a camera, and a chunk of explosives packed inside. No crew, no fancy radar. Just a remote-controlled boat, guided by satellite signals and basic AI, designed to sail straight into a target and detonate. Each one cost less than a luxury car, pennies compared to the billion-dollar warships it was meant to challenge. At first, even their own military wasn't sure. "You want to send this against a frigate?" one officer reportedly asked, holding a prototype with a skeptical frown. But the team kept testing, tweaking, failing, and trying again. They ran trials in rivers, lakes, even swimming pools. They learned how saltwater corroded circuits, how waves could knock a drone off course, how Russian electronic warfare could jam signals. Every failure taught them something new. What made the Sea Baby different wasn't just its design, it was the people behind it. Many of them had lost homes, friends, or family in the early weeks of the invasion. For them, this wasn't just a project. It was a way to fight back when they couldn't hold a rifle. One young engineer later admitted he worked 20-hour days because, "If I stopped, I'd start thinking about everything I'd lost." Another said she joined the team after her hometown was shelled. She wanted to do something that mattered, even if no one ever knew her name. They didn't have a fancy factory. Much of the work happened in garages, basements, and borrowed university labs. Tools were shared. Parts were scavenged or 3D printed. When a shipment of motors got delayed, someone figured out how to modify old outboard engines from fishing boats. When they needed better waterproofing, a former surfboard shaper showed up with resin and fiberglass cloth. It was messy, chaotic, and deeply human, far from the image of high-tech warfare most people imagined. And yet slowly the tiny boats began to work. By late summer, the first real tests at sea showed promise. The drones could travel over 600 miles, stay low in the water to avoid radar, and hit within meters of their target. Still, no one outside their circle believed they'd ever face real warships. Even the team had doubts. "We knew the theory," one member said later. "But theory doesn't sink steel." Then came October. Under a moonless sky just before dawn, 5 Sea Babies slipped silently into the Black Sea from a hidden cove near Ochakiv. Their mission was simple: find the Sergei Kotov, a Russian patrol ship guarding the entrance to the Kerch Strait, and strike. The operators watched from a bunker miles away, eyes glued to screens showing live feeds from the drone's cameras. Their hearts pounded. This was it, the first real test. Russian radar picked up the blips but dismissed them as noise. Small boats were common in the area, fishing vessels, rescue craft, even smugglers. No one expected an attack from something so small. Then 2 explosions lit up the night. The Sea Babies hit the ship's hull just above the waterline. Flames shot into the air. Alarms blared across the Russian fleet. The Sergei Kotov didn't sink. It was too sturdy for that, but it was badly damaged. More importantly, it was humiliated. For the first time, Russia's mighty fleet had been hurt by something it had laughed at just weeks before. Back in Kiev, the team didn't cheer. They were too exhausted, too tense. But someone quietly passed around a thermos of strong, sweet tea. No one spoke for a long time. Then one of them whispered, "They're listening now." News of the attack spread fast. At first, Russia denied it happened. Then they claimed it was a malfunction. But satellite images didn't lie. The world began to take notice. Military experts who'd once rolled their eyes now leaned in closer. Could this really work? For the people building the drones, the victory wasn't about fame or glory. It was about hope. Hope that even when you're outgunned, outmanned, and overlooked, you can still find a way to fight back. That sometimes the smallest things, built by ordinary hands, fueled by quiet determination, can shake the biggest powers. And so, while the world kept watching tanks and missiles, a new kind of war was being born on the waves. Not with thunderous cannons, but with quiet motors. Not with fleets of steel, but with fleets of fiberglass. And behind every launch was a human story. Of loss, of grit, and of the stubborn belief that even the tiniest armada can change the tide. After that first strike on the Sergei Kotov, everything changed, but not in the way most people expected. There were no parades, no headlines shouting Ukraine's secret weapon. In fact, for weeks the whole thing stayed quiet. The team behind the tiny boats didn't want attention. They knew that if Russia figured out how the drones worked, they'd find ways to stop them. So they kept their heads down, stayed off social media, and went back to work. But inside their workshop the mood had shifted. Before they'd been experimenting, guessing, hoping. Now they had proof. Their idea could actually hurt the enemy. That knowledge lit a fire in them. They started working faster, smarter. They added better cameras so operators could see targets more clearly. They improved the steering so the drones could dodge floating debris or sudden waves. They even figured out how to make the drones look like regular fishing boats on radar, just by tweaking the shape of the hull and adding simple reflectors. Meanwhile, out on the Black Sea, Russian ships began acting strangely. They stopped sailing in straight lines. They zigzagged, circled, sometimes even turned back to port for no clear reason. Sailors posted online about ghost boats and phantom attacks. Rumors spread through Russian naval circles that Ukraine had some kind of underwater weapon or secret missile. No one guessed the truth, that the threat came from something small enough to fit in a garage. The drone team watched all this with quiet satisfaction. They weren't trying to destroy the entire fleet. They knew that was impossible. Their real goal was simpler: make the sea unsafe for Russia. If warships couldn't sit comfortably near Ukraine's ports, then grain ships might have a chance to get through. Farmers could sell their wheat. Families in Africa and the Middle East could get food. That was the bigger picture, not just hitting metal, but reopening life. By early 2023, they were ready for another mission. This time, the target was bigger. The Ivanovets, a modern Russian corvette known for launching cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities. It was faster, better armed, and always surrounded by patrol boats. Attacking it would be far riskier. The night of the operation was cold and windy. Rain drizzled over the coast, making the sea choppy. 3 drones were launched from a hidden beach, their motors muffled by the sound of waves. Operators huddled around laptops in a damp basement, eyes locked on grainy video feeds. Every bump in the water made their stomachs drop. One drone lost signal for 12 terrifying seconds, then reconnected. Another nearly ran into a fishing net, but they kept going. When the Ivanovets finally appeared on screen, its lights glowing like a floating city, the room went silent. The lead drone adjusted its course, creeping closer, staying low in the swells. Then impact, a flash. A second later, another explosion. 2 direct hits. Flames erupted along the ship's side. Within minutes, the corvette was listing badly. It didn't sink right away, but it was done. Russia later admitted it had to be towed back to port, heavily damaged. This time, the world couldn't ignore what happened. Satellite images showed the burning ship. Western news outlets finally started calling it what it was: a drone attack. Military analysts scrambled to understand how something so small could take down a high-tech warship. Some called it a fluke. Others said it was a turning point. But back in Ukraine, the people building the drones didn't see it as magic or luck. They saw it as teamwork, trial, and tears. One of the engineers had spent 3 sleepless nights fixing a glitch in the guidance system just days before the mission. Another had driven 10 hours through checkpoints to deliver a batch of waterproof batteries. These weren't soldiers in uniform, they were neighbors, students, parents doing whatever they could with whatever they had. What made their work so powerful wasn't just the explosions, it was the message it sent. For months, Ukraine had been portrayed as the underdog, the victim, the country that could only survive if others helped. But these tiny boats showed something else, that Ukrainians weren't just waiting for rescue. They were inventing, adapting, fighting back in ways no one predicted, and the impact went beyond the sea. In villages near the front lines, people heard about the drone strikes and felt a spark of pride. Kids started drawing pictures of little boats with explosions. Farmers joked that their tractors were next. "We'll drone the tanks." Even elderly women knitting in bomb shelters would ask, "Did the little boats go out tonight?" The Russian Navy, meanwhile, was scrambling. They started dropping nets around their ships, hoping to catch the drones before they got close. They deployed electronic jammers to block signals. They even sent helicopters to patrol the coastline, looking for launch sites. But every time they adapted, the drone team found a new way around it. They switched communication frequencies. They launched drones from rivers instead of beaches. They used decoys, empty boats that looked real on radar, to draw fire away from the real attackers. It became a strange kind of cat-and-mouse game, played out on water and waves. But unlike traditional warfare, this wasn't about who had the biggest gun. It was about who could think faster, move quieter, and care more. One evening, after a successful mission, a young technician sat outside the workshop, staring at the stars. Someone asked how he felt. He didn't say proud or excited. He just said, "I wish my brother could see this." His brother had died defending a town in the east, months before the first drone ever touched water. For him, every launch was a promise. We're still here. We're still fighting. That's what made the tiny Armada so human. It wasn't built by faceless machines or distant generals. It was built by people who carried grief in their pockets and hope in their hands. They didn't wear medals. They wore hoodies and work gloves. They didn't give speeches. They gave their time, their sleep, their sanity, sometimes their lives. And slowly, quietly, they were changing the rules of war. Not with noise, but with nerve. Not with size, but with smarts. Not with hatred, but with the simple, stubborn will to protect their home. By the spring of 2023, Russian ships had stopped anchoring near Odessa altogether. The sea, once a zone of fear, began to feel like it might belong to Ukraine again. And every time a grain ship safely left port, every time a child in Somalia got bread made from Ukrainian wheat, it was partly because of those little boats, and the ordinary people who refused to believe they were too small to matter. As the months went by, something unexpected started happening across Ukraine. People began pitching in to build the tiny boats, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. What had begun as a small group of engineers in a Kiev workshop was now spreading like quiet wildfire. In cities, towns, and even villages far from the sea, ordinary folks were finding ways to help. A retired school teacher in Lviv sold her gold earrings and sent the money to a drone fund with a note that just said, "For the sea." A group of high school students in Dnipro used their robotics club budget to design a better rudder system. In a basement near Kharkiv, a former auto mechanic started rewiring old electric motors from scooters to power the drone's propellers. No one was waiting for permission. They saw a need and they filled it however they could. This wasn't government-run. It wasn't even fully organized. It was messy, personal, and deeply human. People shared blueprints online like recipes. Someone would post, "I found a way to make the hull lighter using recycled plastic," and within hours 3 other workshops would try it out. Mistakes were common. Sometimes a batch of drones would sink on launch because the sealant wasn't strong enough. But no one gave up. They'd just say, "Okay, try again," and go back to work. And the cost? Shockingly low. While a single Russian cruise missile cost over $1 million, one of these sea drones could be built for less than a quarter of that. Some were even cheaper, especially when people donated parts or worked for free. That meant Ukraine could afford to send out dozens at a time, knowing that even if half failed, the other half might get through. It was a new kind of math, not about who had the most weapons, but who could make the most tries. The Russian Navy, used to fighting with massive budgets and rigid chains of command, had no answer for this. How do you defend against an enemy that doesn't need a factory? That builds weapons in garages and launches them from fishing villages? That treats failure as just another step toward success. By mid-2023, the tiny Armada wasn't so tiny anymore. Dozens of drones were being built every week. New models appeared. Some faster, some stealthier, some designed to carry extra explosives for bigger ships. One version even had a second camera pointed upward, so operators could confirm they'd hit the right target before detonating. Every update came from real experience, not theory. If a drone missed because of a wave, they'd adjust the buoyancy. If a signal dropped near a certain island, they'd test new antennas. But the real magic wasn't in the tech. It was in the people. Take the woman who used to run a small bakery in Odessa. When her shop was damaged in a missile strike, she didn't reopen. Instead, she turned her kitchen into a drone assembly station. Her rolling pins became tools for smoothing fiberglass. Her ovens, once used for bread, now cured resin. She said, "If I can't feed people with flour, I'll help feed them with freedom." Or the group of university students who skipped graduation ceremonies to finish a batch of guidance systems. They slept on couches, ate instant noodles, and celebrated small wins like a drone surviving a saltwater test for 12 hours straight. When someone asked why they didn't just leave the country like many of their friends, one of them said simply, "This is where we're needed." Even children got involved. Safely, of course. In schools that still held classes, teachers turned drone design into science projects. Kids built model versions from cardboard and tested them in bathtubs, learning about buoyancy, wind resistance, and navigation. It wasn't play, it was preparation. They were growing up in a world where defending your home might mean knowing how to code a camera or mix epoxy glue, and the impact on the sea kept growing. Russian ships, once bold and unchallenged, now moved like nervous prey. They avoided certain areas. They traveled in tighter groups. They spent more time in port, far from Ukraine's coast. That gave Ukrainian grain ships a chance, real breathing room to sail out and deliver food to countries that desperately needed it. A single drone strike might not sink a warship, but it could scare an entire fleet into retreat, and that changed everything. What made this effort so powerful was that it belonged to everyone. There was no single leader, no famous face claiming credit. The success came from hundreds of quiet acts. The welder who stayed late to fix a cracked hull, the coder who debugged software at 3 a.m., the driver who risked shelling to deliver batteries to the coast. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense, they were just people who refused to sit still while their country burned, and they kept learning. After one mission failed because Russian jammers blocked the signal, the team didn't panic. They studied how the jamming worked, then built a backup system that switched to a different frequency mid-journey. When drones started getting caught in fishing nets, they added small cutters to the front. Every problem became a puzzle, and every solution came from someone who cared enough to solve it. This kind of grassroots effort also gave people something they desperately needed: purpose. In a war full of loss and helplessness, building a drone was something you could do. It was tangible. You could hold the parts in your hands, test the motor, watch it glide across water, and when it worked, when it actually struck a target, you knew you'd played a part in pushing back the darkness. There were no medals, no parades, no headlines with their faces. But in their hearts they knew. They were the invisible Navy, not because they hid, but because they didn't need to be seen to make a difference. By the summer of 2023, the Black Sea had shifted. Ukraine wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back in ways no one predicted. And it wasn't because of some secret superweapon. It was because of ordinary people, working together, refusing to believe that small things don't matter. They proved that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in a basement workshop, waiting for the right moment to sail into the storm. Behind every drone that slipped into the Black Sea was a person, someone who had stayed up all night checking wiring, someone who had cried after a failed test, someone who whispered a quiet good luck before hitting the launch button. These weren't soldiers in uniform standing on a deck. They were neighbors, students, parents, people who'd never imagined they'd be building weapons but who stepped up because there was no one else. One of them had been a marine biologist before the war. She used to study dolphins and sea turtles, tracking their movements with underwater cameras. Now she used that same knowledge to help design drones that moved quietly through the water, mimicking the way small boats naturally rocked with the waves. She said it felt strange, using her love for the sea to fight a war on it. But she reminded herself, I'm not hurting the ocean. I'm protecting the people who live beside it. Another had been a video game developer. He'd spent years creating virtual worlds where players flew spaceships or raced cars. When the invasion started, he shut down his studio and joined the drone team. At first, others were skeptical. What does gaming have to do with real war? But he showed them. He adapted game controllers to steer the drones, making the interface so intuitive that even someone with no military training could operate one after a few hours of practice. He even added a simple heads-up display, like in racing games, showing speed, distance, and battery life. If it feels familiar, he said, people won't panic when things go wrong. Then there was the retired ship captain. He'd spent 40 years sailing cargo vessels across oceans, reading weather patterns, navigating by stars when GPS failed. Now in his late 60s, he couldn't fight on the front lines, but he could teach. He ran training sessions in a borrowed community center, using fishing maps and toy boats to show young operators how currents worked, how fog affected visibility, how to tell a warship from a civilian vessel just by its silhouette. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that made you believe everything would be okay even when it wasn't. These people didn't wear uniforms. They wore hoodies, work boots, sometimes the same t-shirt for 3 days straight. They drank too much coffee, argued over the best way to waterproof a circuit board, and shared earphones to listen to music while they worked. But when a mission was about to launch, the room would fall silent. Not out of fear, but out of respect. They knew what was at stake, and it wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about what came after. Every time a Russian ship was damaged or forced to retreat, Ukrainian ports could breathe again. Grain ships carrying wheat, corn, sunflower oil could finally leave. That food didn't just feed Ukraine. It went to countries in Africa, the Middle East, places where children went to bed hungry. So for this team, success wasn't measured only in explosions, but in meals served and families fed and hope restored. They also carried heavy things no one saw. One technician kept a photo of his hometown taped inside his toolbox. A town now occupied, its streets empty, its school turned into a barracks. Every drone he built was a message to those who took it. We haven't forgotten you. Another had lost a close friend in the first weeks of the war. He never talked about it, but others noticed he always worked the night shift like he was trying to outrun his thoughts. When a drone missed its target, they didn't blame the operator. They gathered around the screen, replayed the footage, and asked, "What can we learn?" Failure wasn't shame, it was data. And when a drone struck true, they didn't cheer loudly. Sometimes they just sat in silence for a minute, heads bowed, as if honoring the weight of what they'd done. They called themselves the Invisible Navy, not because they were hiding, but because they didn't need recognition. No one knew their faces. No medals hung on their walls. But in coastal towns, people began leaving small gifts at drone workshops, bottles of homemade jam, knitted gloves, handwritten notes that said things like, "Thank you for giving us back the sea." What made them different from traditional armies was their closeness. In big militaries, orders come from the top. Here, ideas came from anyone. The person sanding hulls might suggest a better shape. The one testing batteries might notice a pattern no one else saw. Everyone's voice mattered. And that made the work feel personal, not mechanical. They also understood something deeper, that war isn't just about destroying the enemy. It's about protecting what you love. And what they loved wasn't just land or borders. It was the smell of bread from a village oven, the sound of kids playing in a park, the quiet hum of a city at night that wasn't lit by missile flares. Their drones weren't just weapons. They were shields, small, fast, and fiercely human. Even their workspace reflected this. Posters of sea maps hung next to drawings made by children. A shelf held spare parts next to a pot of sunflowers someone had planted in a tin can. There was laughter, too. Silly jokes, shared snacks. The kind of warmth that keeps people going when the world feels cold. And through it all, they held on to a simple belief. We are small, but we are many. One person couldn't build a fleet, but hundreds of people, each doing a little, could change the course of a war. They didn't see themselves as warriors. They saw themselves as caretakers of their country, their future, their dignity. And every time a tiny boat left the shore, it carried not just explosives but the quiet courage of ordinary people who refused to let fear win. That's what made the Invisible Navy so powerful. Not the tech, not the tactics, but the humanity behind every bolt, every wire, every launch. They proved that even in the darkest times people can come together, not for glory but for each other. And sometimes that's enough to turn the tide. By late 2023, something remarkable had happened on the Black Sea, something no one predicted when the war began. The Russian Navy, once bold and unchallenged, had pulled back. Its big warships no longer loomed near Odessa, or patrolled the grain corridors with confidence. Instead, they'd retreated hundreds of miles east, hiding in ports far from Ukraine's coast. The sea, which had been a weapon turned against Ukraine, was slowly becoming a lifeline again. Grain ships, once stuck in port, their cargo rotting while the world waited, were now sailing freely. Farmers who'd watched their harvests gather dust finally saw their wheat reach markets in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Families who depended on that food breathed easier. And it wasn't because of a grand peace deal or a sudden shift in global politics. It was because of small, uncrewed boats and the quiet determination of the people who built them. Back in the early days, Russian TV hosts had laughed at those boats. They called them toys, jokes, nonsense. Now those same channels ran worried segments about Ukrainian sea monsters and mysterious underwater threats. Naval officers who once strutted on deck now spoke in hushed tones about phantom attacks and ghost fleets. The laughter had turned to silence and then to fear, but in Ukraine there was no gloating. The people behind the drones knew better. They'd seen too much loss to celebrate with pride. Instead, they felt relief and responsibility. Every successful mission meant more than just a damaged ship. It meant another day of safety for coastal towns, another chance for a child to go to school without hearing explosions, another shipment of food to reach someone who needed it. The world began to take notice too. Military academies in Europe and North America started studying what Ukraine had done, not to copy it exactly but to understand a new truth. In modern warfare, size doesn't always win. Ingenuity does. Speed does. And most of all, people do. Generals who once believed only billion-dollar destroyers mattered now admitted that a $250,000 drone, built in a garage by volunteers, could change the balance of power. Yet, for those building the drones, none of that mattered much. They weren't thinking about textbooks or future wars. They were thinking about tomorrow's launch, about whether the new waterproof seal would hold, about whether the operator on night shift had eaten enough. They stayed focused on the work, not the fame, and the work kept growing. New workshops opened in towns that had once felt forgotten. People who'd never touched a circuit board learned how to solder. Teachers turned classrooms into drone labs. Even artists helped, painting the hulls in matte black or designing camouflage patterns that blended with seafoam. It wasn't just a military effort anymore. It was a national act of care. What made it so powerful was how deeply human it remained. There were no faceless factories, no cold automated lines. Every drone carried the fingerprints, sometimes literally, of someone who believed in its purpose. One builder always tucked a tiny sunflower seed into the battery compartment before sealing it. For luck, he'd say. Another played a lullaby on her phone while testing motors, saying the rhythm helped her stay calm. These weren't details of war. They were details of life, and life, even in wartime, kept pushing through. In coastal villages, kids played near the water again, knowing the ships offshore were Ukrainian grain carriers, not enemy missiles. Fishermen returned to their boats, nets in hand, eyes scanning the horizon not for threats but for the next catch. The sea was becoming a place of work and peace once more, not fear. The drone team watched all this from the shadows. They didn't march in parades. They didn't give interviews. Most refused to be photographed. But when a grain ship passed safely out of port, they allowed themselves a quiet smile. That was their victory. They also knew the fight wasn't over. Russia kept trying new tricks, floating barriers, drone detecting radar, even trained dolphins, though that turned out to be more rumor than reality. But the Ukrainian teams adapted faster. They launched drones from rivers, not just beaches. They used decoys that looked real on radar. They even developed a version that could swim just below the surface for part of its journey, popping up only near the target. Every challenge became a puzzle, and every solution came from someone who cared enough to solve it. Most importantly, they never forgot why they started. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection, about giving their country a chance to breathe, to heal, to feed the world again, and in that they'd already succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. Today, if you walk along certain parts of Ukraine's southern coast at dawn, you might see small shapes being loaded onto trailers or tested in calm inlets. They look unimpressive, just fiberglass shells with motors and cameras. But to those who know the story, there's something else entirely. They're proof that courage doesn't need to be loud. That hope can be built with glue, wire, and stubborn love for home. The world may never know the names of the people behind the tiny Armada, and that's okay. They never wanted fame, they just wanted to help. And in doing so, they showed everyone a simple, powerful truth. Even the smallest things, when guided by human hands and hearts, can move mountains. Or in this case, turn the tide of the sea.